Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So for those of you that weren't here, for the previous session, I'm Jerry Gable with Axiomatics. This is the new moves in authorization track. Next up is my colleague, Matt Carter, who's going to talk about microservices security and some other stuff. And I guess you need to start out by explaining that square over there, why that didn't render. So I'll turn it over to Matt.
K wanted to be a square today. Who can say? Welcome to last week this morning, where we'll be talking about authorization for microservices, which may just be services-oriented architecture regifted with cute little mammal mascots. My name is Matt Carter, and I am from Axiomatics. Now, more so, there have been a number of technology changes since services-oriented architecture went into that trough of disillusionment. Many of you will recognize this fortune-telling ASCII representation of the Docker whale. This is one of my favorites. What I'm going to be talking to you about today is how you keep that whale from spewing sensitive, critical infrastructure information or proprietary data in an uncontrolled fashion, because that's what's going to get your whale canned. More so than the technology changes, it's the principles of microservices that differentiate it from SOA. Sam Newman is an author who wrote the book Building Microservices that talks about a number of these principles, such as decentralize all the things, hiding implementation details, culture of automation, making sure that microservices are very focused on a single business purpose, business domain. But where he says organizations will get the most benefit out of it is making sure these services are able to act autonomously. They can deliver releases independent from other business domains and other microservices, delivering functionality on a weekly, hourly, by minute basis, more and more functionality. Mr. Newman likes to represent microservices as hexagons because he says it defeats the tyranny of the layer. And I've got a video of where you get the British accent. Microservices can call other microservices in an asynchronous, fault-tolerant manner. They can be consumed by composite applications. And the layer thing with SOA, you had a business tier and a presentation tier and a data tier. Now you have services that have a name that describe what they do. Another principle of microservices that you hear is the notion of smart endpoint dumb pipe. This is a departure from SOA, where you had a service bus that often had business functionality like aggregation and transformation, and this caused a tight coupling between that service bus intermediary, the middleware layer, and the business layer. And in organizations where you have this deploy anywhere model, where you have microservices being pushed up to an infrastructure or platform as a service provider or an on-prem, you don't necessarily know or care where this is being deployed, that coupling is a problem. So with that in mind, let's ask the question, can and should authorization, and more specifically policy decision, itself be modeled as a microservice? Let's look at some of the characteristics of a policy decision point. It's stateless and immutable, meaning you don't have to do a lot to it when you spin up that policy decision container. It may need an updated policy, and then it's ready to go. It provides a well-defined, understood interface through standards like ZACML. Isn't that what our improv group called it? It provides a lightweight protocol through a RESTful interface, and it supports the notion of bounded context. What the term record means in the music industry is different from record in the health industry, obviously, and your authorization engine needs to understand that through namespaces or separate policy trees. So absolutely, policy decision can and should be represented just as another hexagon. This is going to make your conversation with your microservices MSA architects much easier. They are going to understand this is just another call out. All of these other microservices are already networked. Why should authorization be any different? Alongside other access control concerns like adaptive risk, token validation, user info, SCIM. So hopefully I'm preaching to the choir in terms of the need for dynamic runtime authorization as opposed to apathetic authorization, lethargic authorization, or role-based authorization. Now, don't get me wrong, RBAC absolutely has its place in certain models, but I think the overuse of RBAC and leveraging it for trying to build contextual models by, if I don't have a role for this set of entitlements. I'm just going to create a new one, and we get to that role explosion situation. And then consultants coming in said, we're just going to build you a new role model. And then a year later, you're right back in the same position, right? We need to get out of that endless loop. Another issue is in terms of how we handle authorization in an OAuth context. One of the problems we frequently see, because OAuth doesn't natively handle this, is called confused deputy. And let me give you a video. This is basically the violation of least privilege within where a client can consume data either accidentally or maliciously from producers that it isn't necessarily entitled to. Let's see a quick video by Sam Newman, our author, describing this problem and how he might address it.
Microservices called the confused deputy problem. And the confused deputy problem is a class of problem where you can trick an intermediate party into asking for things they shouldn't be able to get. So I could be logged in as Sam, but I could formulate a request in this previous example to the music web shop saying, can I have Alice's data? Now, I am logged in. I am authenticated as Sam. Unless the music web shop is, rechecks that I'm authorized to get Alice's data, or there's a bug in how I handle that authorized code, I may then allow that call to go downstream. And what we often find is in these situations where we have these calls, where maybe you've even got guarantees that the server is the server and the client is the client, and so yes, these really are the real things talking to each other, but we then sort of embrace this idea of implicit trust. It's almost like a hive mentality in a way. We sort of work on the assumption that the user service says, oh, is that the music web shop asking me for something? It is? Okay, great. Well, whatever it wants, it can have. But we don't revalidate whether or not the initiating call from me is authorized to access that information. Now, there are ways of solving this problem. Some of them historically have been quite nasty. Are there any SAML fans in the room? There's a few, wow. We don't admit it. Now, theoretically, you can solve this problem using nested SAML assertions.
Holy cow, we've got a guy that literally wrote the book on microservices, and his lead-in for security is nested SAML. Now, I'm not going to argue the pros and cons of JSON versus XML here, but I don't think this is going to be very compelling to anyone. So that's a problem where our microservice experts aren't necessarily giving the best advice. Another problem, ramifications of the smart endpoint dumb pipe approach, is that it essentially forces you into a decentralized enforcement model where everybody's kind of responsible for enforcing security and policy in their own particular way. That's a challenge. Developers left to govern themselves. And oh, by the way, you need to hire more female engineers and security practitioners. Developers left to govern themselves will choose convenience and timeline over best practices in authorization. OAuth supports this with their newly published top 10 list. Broken access control continues to move its way up to the charts and acknowledging underprotected APIs as well. So what do we do about this? Let's look at a classic OAuth flow where we have a client getting a token issuance and then making a request for some data. Now, oftentimes I see the resource server being lumped together with the business server into one entity. I think we need to separate those out and basically have a high cohesion of policy enforcement at that resource server level. It doesn't necessarily have to be a single point of entry. It could be a ping access agent or a very lightweight API gateway, but I think we need that separation to provide consistent policy enforcement. And it doesn't necessarily have to make this a smart pipe. We can continue to have it be dumb because we are externalizing the policy decision because that's just another microservice, right? This is the API gateway and resource server are very strategically positioned because they have all of the context of the client, who's calling it, who the resource is that they're calling on behalf of, and they also have context about the resources they're trying to access. Is that data labeled PII? As Justin talked about, this is contextual. It's gray area. We don't know. We cannot anticipate who is consuming this. So we need to externalize that policy decision. Again, high cohesion of our policies in one place. And the policy decision can go and supplement that information if needed in other attribute sources. Now, specific business domain logic and policy rules, you could argue it should be contained within a microservice, right? We have electronic health record data. Primary care physician can view his or her own assigned records. That's very specific to health records and that microservice. But I would argue that having that co-located with more global policies, such as how PII is handled, may be consistent across multiple microservices, and being able to manage your local policy, your domain-specific policy, and be able to reference these global policies side by side gives you a better picture. Also, you have technology-driven policies like preventing confused deputy. A simple comparison of the subject in the request with the resource owner ID of this, in the payload can prevent that sort of action from occurring. And then you're incorporating other risk adaptive callouts within that policy. So very, very consistent. Now, I'm making a number of assumptions here that data has value and that we're going to want to share that data. Ugh. Well, maybe not quite that. Can we get a little bit more business specific? Okay, that's a little better. Boo, right? So ISPs are sharing your browsing data, right? And they're going to want to not necessarily share all data to all people, right? They're going to want to do this perhaps in a tiered subscription model where they have different loyalty levels, and what a gold subscriber gets versus a silver subscriber may be driven by tagging of the data that they're trying to access, right? So that's a driver of different data for different people. Or different consumers. Another easy one is privacy. How you share data in Europe is obviously going to be different from how you share it in North America. And it's not just where the client resides, it may be the data itself and how it's labeled. I'm a big fan of providing label-based security and metadata on the data so that as that data goes downstream to different microservices, we have the context to be able to make that authorization request. In this case, we have a German country code attribute of the data that's redacted for this particular client, while a US data, the PII, may be passed through. How that is performed, if you look at the client and the producer, we're not going to necessarily make that enforcement on the request. We're going to do it on the response, the dotted line. This gives us the ability to introspect the payload and potentially modify it. So we've got information about the payload. We know that it's German data. We know that it's labeled PII. We're going to make that authorization request. Can this client view that data in this context? We may get a permit or deny. We can still do transactional authorization, block the request or allow it, but we may want to allow it and filter certain fields. Now that singleton pattern, requesting a single record, maps very well to the XACML request response standard protocol. But what happens when you're accessing a set of records? That's a little bit different in terms of patterns. So take our producer where we have a set of data and we have multiple clients that are have to consume it in different ways. We have client 1 that only gets rows where the color is red. We have client 2 that needs pricing data masked out based on the values of yet another column, right? Now, it's unscalable to expect to create different physical services for each of these levels of access. You just can't do that. So how do we use the access control mechanisms to filter the data dynamically based on the conditions? Here's one pattern where this is a solution that Axiomatics provides where you can essentially have a SQL statement modified dynamically based on the context and how it's being asked. So we get the predicate, the where statement, added dynamically by the application calling it, and this can all be encapsulated within a single microservice. And that's very applicable to a relational database model, but that may not necessarily always be what you're trying to do. What we're seeing now is people wanting to enforce data filtering at the API level. And with SQL, there's a standard. The vendors know how to map conditions to predicates. With JSON, you don't know what the request and the response are going to look like necessarily. So you need conventions, either within your organization or within a community of interest, or maybe even a vendor-specific approach. What that might look like is, for our JSON filter microservice, perhaps it returns a JSON path expression, which which supports wildcarding, so you can do multiple records, and you can also leverage predicate logic there to say, filter all records where shoe size is greater than 10. Again, based on conditional context of how it's being asked. Of course, the API gateway or whatever resource server intermediary needs to know how to get that expression and parse out the actual data. So there has to be some sort of technology know-how, and there's no standards around this today, so vendors, listen up, maybe that's an opportunity there. So you see that we are redacting or masking the price in this particular scenario. Another pattern might be, this is Apogee specific, where that particular API gateway can support take an action, either include or exclude, take an object and a set of fields, and it knows what to do already. So that's an example of that pre-existing pattern where the JSON filter can return that based on these conditions. Here's what it looks like within the actual developer console of OAuth. Notice the only thing we're doing on the request side is validating the OAuth token. All of the actual policy enforcement, we're getting the actual resource data, introspecting, making the call out to the policy decision service, getting the permit or deny, and then also the expression of how to do that form filter, the action object field. All right, good. This is a little bit more of the controversial side, so I'm jumping just a little bit on subjects here. How do scopes fit in? Scopes provide an excellent mechanism for the resource owner to delegate to the client consent to access his or her data on some business service, right? This is a discretionary access control model. What I'm seeing today is the overuse of scopes to be leveraged in a mandatory access control model, and I think that's incomplete. I can walk into a military facility with 2 forms of ID, dressed in battle dress uniform, holding Willy Wonka's golden ticket. But somebody needs to evaluate what those claims or scopes enables me to do within that building, right? There still needs to be about decision-making happening at the resource server. Here's a quote from Vadim Lander, who wrote much of SiteMinder. This is to point out that it's not a question of granularity. It's not fine versus coarse, because you can create as many scopes as you want. The challenge is, and he's talking about that last sentence there, the users need to expect this, and this is his underlining, by the way. Users need to understand what that scope means. And he's talking about that in a delegation model. You get the pop-up, do you consent for client to do X? You have to understand what X means to make that decision, right? I would say the same thing applies to the resource server and your developers, having to know what those scopes mean in order to write policy against that. That, by definition, is tight coupling. And the road we're heading down with that is embedding a whole lot of authorization logic in our microservices that need to be externalized. It's the same thing we did with web applications back in the 90s with RBAC. I see some of this where if you want to leverage an external scope management system and this is fine. If you want to have more scopes to do more things than just consent, but it's incomplete. You still need that microservice externalizing authorization to a policy decision service to evaluate what those scopes entitle you to. And just to compare RBAC back in the 90s, using Spring annotations things, we basically used kind of the has role annotation, right? Everybody's familiar with that? If has role admin, do this. And that's where a lot of that security logic got really fragile and baked in, right? Is this any different? OAuth has scope. It's the same exact trap, all right? And the role explosion problem we have today, tomorrow we're going to have a scope explosion as well if we don't address this. Think about it. So in summary, separate out the resource server from the business application and consolidate your policy enforcement in a consistent manner for high cohesion. Enforce authorization on the response leg so that you can incorporate attributes and characteristics of the resource in your policy decisioning. Leverage scopes for what they were intended to be, delegated consent. Don't leverage them for mandatory access control models. I think we need to expand further conventions and standards around filtering multiple datas at the JSON level through conventions and for data level filtering of APIs. All right, and if we do all this well, perhaps our well will be exonerated. My name is Matt Carter. I have a number of articles on our Axiomatics blog on this topic and other stuff. So if you like what you heard, catch me afterwards. I'll be here for the rest of the day. Thank you very much. Questions?
All right. Thanks very much, Matt. We've got a few minutes for questions. Did you have one? Okay.
Could you elaborate a little more on the filtering data at the JSON level? Do you see the PDP returning any indication to the PEP to do that, or how does that work?
One way to model that would be attaching an obligation to an access control decision so that for that particular scenario, that data is labeled PII and the data is European, for instance. In that case, it's a permit plus an obligation, and that obligation is intended to be enforced by the resource server to filter the data. I didn't hear that. Yes, obligations are free form, right? So you can make them look however you want to. I can show you how I did it in Apogee if you want to check that out, what that might look like. But it's not limited to obligations. You could leverage a reverse query type approach. There's a number. It's really pretty open right now. Like I said, there's no standards around it. So multiple ways to skin that cat.
So in your model, you say that, I understand that you're saying the PDP should be invoked in order to do filtering on the response side, because you might have that point in time where you want to do revocations of data, but you still have it on the request side as well, which is why even make the call if the person isn't authorized to do so?
If you're saying like a token isn't valid or a resource owner has not consented to leveraging the resource, why make the PDP call out? Is that?
Well, I see it as 3 steps. There's the more coarse grain, which is do you have the appropriate scopes? Does the resource even want to satisfy that request? Is your token valid? And then there's the more fine grain, which is, okay, now that I know who you are and where you're coming from, and I trust that you have access to make this call, is there some other policy that PDP should be informed about? Because now you have some context. You don't have the data yet, but you have some context around who the caller is, and there's an authorization request there before you even make the call to your backend.
You can absolutely leverage scopes and any token information that you have as context in that call out to the policy decision. Absolutely include that. And that's part of the consistency of implementing that policy enforcement in a consistent manner. I don't have to worry about if they have a JOT token or not, or what's in that JOT token. I'm just going to pass the whole JOT token and let the PDP parse it out, right? If you want to include the scopes, there's no harm in doing that, right? So absolutely use that. You could argue whether or not how thick you want to make your policy enforcement in terms of, well, if there's a certain scope, don't even make a PDP call. You could have logic around that, but I would recommend just leveraging the policy. Don't leverage policy decision as a security concern, right? It's not a draconian, you must PDP all the time. Leverage it as a business enabler. If policy decision is helpful in a particular scenario, leverage it. If not, don't worry about it, right? That's the whole notion of microservices. It's another service in your catalog, right? I think that'll help adoption, actually, and is not going on that draconian approach.
All right, Matt, I've got one more question back here and then one up front, and I think we'll need to wrap it. Also, the slides will be available after the session. It's a massive file because of all the photos in there, so if you need that, just let us know. So, question back here.
The question related to the filtering side. So you talked about using SQL filters. So that works for the row level filtering. So how do you do the filtering for the column level?
I haven't done column level filtering in JSON. I can't even imagine what that expression would look like, honestly.
Okay.
Yeah, so we do that for the database, but not solved yet for the JSON. All right, we'll take one more question up here. Sorry, we're running out of time.
For fine-grained authorization, how do you strike a balance between the dependencies on contextual data that would be supplied either as a PIP type of callout versus externalizing the policy? So it seems like when these types of solutions have been around for a while, that it always devolves into a discussion about whether or not the fine-grained entitlement check should just live with the code, because that's where a lot of the contextual data is required to make the decision.
Agree. So the policy enforcement point is often going to have that resource data because it's closest to that. It becomes a design question of when to call out to an external service if the policy enforcement point can already get that. Is that kind of where you're going?
Yes, it just seems like the conversation quickly turns into, well, then we may as well keep it in the code because if we externalize it, we've got these dependencies.
Like Justin talked about, right? We can't anticipate who the consumer of this data necessarily is. Today it may be internal only. Tomorrow we may find that this has value. We can sell it and it's going to be external clients, and we need to treat them differently and filter it differently. So trying to basically make assumptions about that to say we can keep it simple and keep it in the code, you're losing the flexibility of that long-term consumer opportunity.
All right, Matt, thank you very much. Thanks for attending.